Welcome again to Word Crumbs. Today is Wednesday of Ordinary Time, and if you're still with these reflections, I'd like to congratulate you because for me it's an appreciation of how we can learn to reflect on our faith based on scriptures themselves. So, one thing is to just receive them on a plate. Um, Another thing is to really try to personally meditate on the scriptures in order to draw out what our faith wants to tell us, our doctrines, our practices, our sacraments, what they want to tell us by personally meditating on themselves through scriptures, no? Allowing scriptures to speak to us. So basically, Word Crumbs is a time for us to think together, to reflect together based on the scriptures, on the precepts or the teachings of our faith. And this week we've been talking about grace, the role of grace in our lives. That grace is a gift that God has given us in the person of Jesus Christ. That the special gift, not the only, but the unique role and the central, essential, or principal role of grace is somehow related to why we are Christians in the first place, because of this grace. So it's not the only thing, but I would say it's really a central and essential element of our faith that we are invited to live as Christians. And so this week we are deepening more on grace itself, how to live in grace, how to live by the grace that God has given us in Jesus Christ. So yesterday we were talking about living by grace through a simple practice, which is to receive each day as a gift. That every day is a gift that God gives to me through His grace. And I have two tasks to do each day, is to receive it and to respond to it. This puts us in a very different perspective in our lives because it helps us to see that life is something to be received daily. It's not something that I control yesterday because yesterday is gone. And yesterday somehow, of course, affects how I live today, but it doesn't condition me. Grace gives me the capacity to choose how I want to live today. Grace sets me free in that sense, free to make a choice, free to personally choose the way I wish to live in this day, to live according to love, not the love of Christ, to love as He loves, to practice what He teaches us through our faith. So grace is not only forgiveness of our sins, grace is to live already as forgiven people. Know that, of course, as human beings or as people, we know that we sin constantly. There are saints that say we sin at least 7 times a day. But it's to start off knowing that basically we are already forgiven. And if ever we fall into sin, as the book of Hebrews says, we can quickly go back, as quickly as possible, go back to Him and to live in the grace of Christ. So grace is a way of life. It's not just being forgiven, it's being capacitated to live in a different way. So today we continue going a bit further or going deeper into understand what is this life of grace and how can we live it? Because I think that there is still a mentality or a certain way of thinking that still focuses a lot about sin. Grace as something to help us overcome sin. But what I would like to, of course, that is very important and that's basic. But what I'd like to do is to bring us a bit one step beyond. And what about after sin? Do we as Christians have nothing else to talk about apart from sin and avoiding sin? So if I avoid sin, then what am I positively meant to do, to live? And this is where I find the meditation on grace so beautiful and so enlightening, and it opens up horizons to what Christian life is all about. If we try to summarize Christian life of grace, basically it's about saying our greatest fulfillment lies in discovering every day the great capacity that God has given us to love. When Peter asked Jesus, if you remember, we left everything to follow you, this life of grace. So what do we have as a reward? He was saying. And Jesus was saying that your greatest reward is to have more sisters and brothers and mothers and fathers and etc. So, meaning it was a love. The reward was to have a love that is constantly expands to include others. The satisfaction of seeing that actually we are capable of a greater love than what we thought. This may sound a bit like, okay, is that it? But if we really experience that capacity of love, it's the greatest freedom that any human being can have in their lives in order to keep on expanding their horizons and growing in understanding who we are and how we are meant and who God is for us and how He has created in us this greatest desires of love, of intimacy, of satisfaction in relationships, and He gives us the capacity, the grace to fulfill it. So, in other words, grace doesn't just have to do with mercy in the sense of forgiveness. Grace has to do with compassion and love. And I think that sets a different tone. The word love. How does grace help us to love? Now, today in the Gospel, Matthew 21 to 16. Okay, this is on this Wednesday of the 20th week. We are invited to meditate on this Gospel that helps us to see one obstacle to live in grace. Okay, so we have been introduced to the idea of grace, invited to follow Jesus in grace. But what is this that stops us many times or often from living in grace? And in a nutshell, it's comparison. Okay, today the gospel presented to us is about the workers in the vineyard. Let us just read it slowly and then we can understand a bit more in what the passage says to us. Jesus said to his disciples, "The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner going out at daybreak to hire workers for his vineyard. He made an agreement with the workers for 1 denarius a day and sent them to his vineyard. Going out at about the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace and said to them, 'You go to my vineyard too, and I will give you a fair wage.' So they went. At about the 6th hour, and again at about the 9th hour, he went out and did the same. Then at about the 11th hour, he went out and found more men standing round, and he said to them, 'Why have you been standing here idle all day?' 'Because no one has hired us,' they answered. He said to them, 'You go into my vineyard too.' In the evening the owner of the vineyard said to his bailiff, 'Call the workers and pay them their wages, starting with the last arrivals and ending with the first.' So those who were hired at about the 11th hour came forward and received 1 denarius each. When the first came, they expected to get more, but they too received 1 denarius each. They took it, but grumbled at the landowner. 'The men who came last,' they said, 'have done only 1 hour, and you have treated them the same as us, though we have done a heavy day's work in all the heat.' He answered one of them and said, 'My friend, I am not being unjust to you. Did we not agree on 1 denarius? Take your earnings and go. I choose to pay the last comer as much as I pay you. Have I no right to do what I want with my own? Why be envious because I am generous? Thus the last will be first, and the first last.'" This is one of the most ingenious passages, personally, that I feel that have been written in the Bible. It speaks about a certain logic of paradox that is ingenious. I don't know how else to say this. We see a situation about fairness, of justice, a certain way of thinking that we're invited to integrate or to understand that comes from God. That's again in this concept of grace. Now, what do I mean? Because both parties um, are talking sense. What do I mean? Look, because the workers in the vineyard who started first are right. It's not fair because they have worked more than the others and they're receiving the same amount. But at the same time, the landowner, is also right and fair because he said, "But that's our agreement. So why are you complaining um, if I'm giving you what we agreed on?" So both are right. And this is where I find this passage so creative to make us think about the way we think, the way we consider justice, the way we consider what is fair and what is not, and what many times stops us to understand God's justice or God's way of logicking things out, His way of loving. And perhaps the only way that we can understand this passage for me today is the logic of love. But anyway, let's try to see how the landowner. I mean, it was even quite mischievous. The landowner, on purpose, made the bailiff pay the workers who came at the 11th hour, so that the first ones could see what he was doing. I mean, if he had paid perhaps those who came earlier first, maybe they would have gone off, no, and happier because they didn't see what the others received. But having seen what the others received, they became jealous. They felt it was unjust, you know, and they complained to the landowner. So it's very creative the way this passage makes us try to consider uh, our own reactions in life. Why can't we appreciate the graces that we receive every day? This one denarius, which is what God promises us every day in order to live and to enjoy life as a gift. And the point here, according to this passage, is comparison. We compare ourselves with others. When we compare ourselves with others, um, sometimes or many times we don't appreciate what we have, who we are, what God has made us, and the capacities He gives us each day to live, to enjoy this life, and to love. You know, when we say that grace is a daily gift, it helps us to remember that a gift is given to someone to make that person happy. You know, God gives us grace and this gift to live each day happily. But when I compare my gift with somebody else's gift, then somehow I don't appreciate this gift as much because I'm not focusing on the person who gave me that gift, but I'm focusing on what others have received. So comparison sometimes, or oftentimes I would say, makes us lose the sense of grace, to lose our focus on the one who gives us that grace, and to ask Him, if you remember the prayer yesterday, to ask Him, what do you want me to do with this grace so that I can make it grow and appreciate the gift that it is for me and for others. So if you like, grace is like a promise that comes to us every day that this day is worth living. It's worth getting out of bed, drawing the curtains, looking at the sunshine or allowing the sun to shine on you and to see that this day is going to be great. I don't know what's going to come. I can't control it from the beginning, but I'm going to receive it and enjoy this day because it's a gift for me. Not for me first, but also for others, of course, that we are also gifts to others. So it sets us on a very optimistic tone each day if we learn how to live in grace. The difficulty then is when I don't live like that, every day could seem gloomy. And actually, today is quite a gloomy day. But grace helps us to see beyond the gloom. That even if I am gloomy, or if others are gloomy, I can live this day with grace if I focus first on the one who has given me this day as a gift. Not on others, not on how others are, or not on how the situation could be gloomy, but on the one who is always bright sunshine, who has given me this gift, which is God in Jesus Christ. Now, on this theme of comparison, now we're seeing that it's many times comparison that makes us lose a sense of the gift. And perhaps many of us are already aware of this. Um, and But I would like to touch on another kind of comparison, which is comparison in different stages of our lives. When we are invited to change a stage from one stage of life to another, sometimes we tend to compare with the past stages. So it's not just comparing with others; it's comparing myself to me, how I was, how things were in the past, and having a kind of nostalgia of the past. In different stages of life, we always have different crises. And nowadays, we don't just talk about midlife crisis, which is a very marked stage that modern psychology has discovered, that I am not the same as before. I'm asked to define myself. And this is something very interesting about comparison, where I define myself not according to what I see in others, but what I have seen in myself, who I am, how I am, and the gifts that I have. So it is a stage of maturity in midlife, if you like, to define who I am before God and before myself, before I compare myself to others. Now, having said that, looking at others is not wrong. It's nice to learn. But if I don't define myself first, that's challenging. Nowadays, they talk even about quarter life crisis. No, when we're 20, in our 20s, going to 30s, we are also asked to define ourselves in a different way. Or when we go to the so-called third stage of life, when we are no longer as strong or as strong-willed even, or we notice that our bodies are failing, and we are reaching a stage of life where we consider we are forced to face our limitations and the limitations of others. That is another crisis that we need to face. That is a change. And so these crises help us to keep on defining who I am, not comparing myself with others at first in the quarter life, and at midlife, not comparing the success that I always projected. And perhaps I'm living in a different person. I aimed to be this, and I discovered I'm not that. I'm me. And I define myself again in front of me. And then as I reach the third stage of life, I start to compare myself with my past, how I was, how things were, how others were. And this could be another challenge of comparison that stops us to see the grace of God at every stage of our lives. When we take on responsibilities in our 20s, when we get married, there are things that go on. That's a grace, it's a challenge. When we reach midlife, when we've achieved everything and we suddenly feel we're not satisfied, that's another challenge, again, another grace to grow. When we reach the third stage of life, when we see that meaning comes from our offspring, how they grow, and we see that, we're reaching the end. That is another grace from God to grow. And comparison is what takes all this away. And what the passage of today reminds us are two things. Face God. Go back and face God, and all these questions and crises, resolve it with Him. If you remember, go back to the original relationship with God that our lives are based on, and sort it out with Him. Ask Him what this is about. Don't look at others. Don't just, comparison is linked also with complaints, complaining about others, blaming others, and sometimes even competing with others. But the whole point of reference in these ways of doing things is the other. The important thing is to go back to myself and God. Sort it out with Him. Ask Him, what is this stage all about? How am I meant to live? How can I accept life, and accept others, accept myself as things are? because when I first accept them, then grace comes in. And I allow the grace of God to open up my perspective in order to see the gift of this stage of life. And the second, of course, the first, as we said, is to go back to God. But the second is to see that He's generous. Our God is not stingy. And many times we don't live by grace because deep in our minds and our hearts, we think that God is stingy. He's testing us, that He's, is playing a game to see how we behave. No, He is super generous. He's not testing us. He wants to give us everything. But we need to learn to receive it through Him. And this idea of Him being generous is what saves us and calls us to live in grace again. If we go back to the passage once again, it says, "Why are you jealous because I am generous?" And this for me is a line that helps me to understand how to go back to grace. Whenever I am jealous, whenever I'm not contented, whenever I'm upset or frustrated, Jesus or God is inviting me to go back to see how generous He is instead. If I'm jealous of somebody else, of how generous God is to him or to her, then I need to go back to realize God wants to be just as generous to me in His own ways, in the way that's most suitable for me. If I find that God was generous in the past of my life, how good He has been to me, and etc., then it helps me to understand that God wants to be just as generous in this stage of my life, where I am now, how I am, who I am, and perhaps even more generous, because that is also justice. So let us go back today to this statement. Why are you upset? Did we not agree on 1 denarius? Let us go back to what God agrees with us, or agreed with us, or what we agreed with Him in terms of the grace and the gift of happiness in our life. Go back to Him, go back to that original promise that God gave to us. Don't compare your expectations of today with the past of yesterday. Try not to compare your expectations of what you see in others that you should have to what God really gives you personally to you and agrees for you. So today, let us continue in this reflections, asking God for this grace. Continue again. Oh, Lord, what is the grace that you want to give me today? Give me the grace to receive that grace and to respond to that grace just for today, not yesterday, not tomorrow, today. Living the grace each day. And when I get tempted to compare this grace with others or with myself, with my past, etc., help me not to be upset with myself, but help me to see in that being upset how I can see that you want to be just as generous with me today.